Welcome back to the Property Investing Roadmap podcast.
An investment in knowledge always pays the best dividends.
My advice is consider the long term, the medium and the now.
I'm your host, Damian Collins, here to help you navigate the twists and turns of property investing.
If you're wanting to snap up those opportunities in a competitive market, you need to be on the ball and be ready.
The first part is start early.
What's your goal in investing?
In Season 2, we're shifting gears to accelerate your journey through 9 key steps to financial freedom. From research and strategy to creating a model property portfolio, this is your step-by-step roadmap to building an income from property for life. Welcome to Step 3 of our journey through the 9 key steps to building an income from property for life. Now, while many investors focus on the property selection, which is really important, it's also equally important how you structure your assets to protect your investments. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, about the different structures, because getting it right from the start can save you significant tax, but importantly also protect your assets. And depending on what profession you're in, that can be very important. Today, we're joined by Jemma Sanderson, Director at Cooper Partners Financial Services. Jemma heads up their self-managed super fund specialist services, a lot of S's in that. And Gemma's is definitely a recognised industry expert. I've seen her speak many times. She's a regular presenter on superannuation and self-managed super funds for the industry bodies across Australia. Has published also a self-managed super fund guide, and that's been published by the Taxation Institute of Australia. So there's no better expert on structures, and I'm delighted to have Jemma here with us today. Welcome, Jemma.
Thanks very much for having me, Damien.
There's lots of different, and we're going to talk about lots of different structures today. We've got companies, trusts, discretionary trusts, unit trusts, self-managed super funds in your own name. There's lots of different types of structures that we're going to talk about today. But it does certainly have a significant impact on tax and asset protection. They all come with their own generally pros and cons, and sometimes the tax issue won't be till much later on. For example, in a company, you don't get a capital gains discount, so the impact of the tax may be some time further down the path. But Jemma, in your experience, what's the biggest mistake you see property investors make with their investment structures?
A lot of the time they don't look at the right structure for an exit. So they're thinking about the best place to put it, perhaps where there's money available, but they're not taking that into consideration in terms of what the tax profile of the return on the investment is, and that's a really big consideration because, to your point earlier about the CGT discount that's not in a company, that's a really big consideration because you don't want to crystallise a capital gain and then you're not getting a discount. So was that the right place for it? Yeah. And that's a really big consideration.
And look, sometimes it's not always that easy, is it? Because, people, if you buy it in a discretionary trust, for example, and you don't have a business where you can inject income to that trust, the losses get trapped, so you lose them temporarily, but there might be other benefits later on, isn't there?
That's 100% correct. That's probably one of the biggest areas where they're generating a negative cash flow. How do you get that income in there to use that cash flow? But perhaps later on you get the benefit of it, but in the intervening period you're having to fund that and you're not getting a tax benefit. You
know, the biggest mistake I see investors make is they actually don't seek advice before investing. I have property. You would think people would think about things for a while before they go and make an offer, and particularly around stamp duty. I think that's one thing that people sometimes put an offer in and say, I'll change it later. Well, not in every state, and obviously this podcast is national, and not in a number of states, if you try and change the name, you can't do and or nominee, you're going to get stung for stamp duty twice. So something to be very aware of, isn't it, Jemma?
Oh, 100%. And that's one of the biggest ones. No one likes to pay stamp duty, but then sometimes people are a bit blasé. Oh, I've put an offer on the property. Oh, hang on a sec. What did you put on that offer? Is it correct? You do not want to be paying stamp duty twice.
No, you don't even want to pay it once. Sadly, we can't
Exactly.
get out of the first time. Can you think of an example, Jemma, where the right structure up front has made a significant difference to investors' outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. As a self-managed super fund nerd, I am a big advocate of self-managed super funds, and they're a really good structure to consider the ownership of property. That investment profile and the return profile really lines up well with a self-managed fund. So if you've got the ability to use capital that's in your SMSF And then because SMSFs can borrow, particularly to acquire property because it's more of a chunky asset, then they can really get the benefit of ongoing. You might still have a negative cash flow, but you've got your super contributions that are going in that can assist there. And then at the back end, when an asset may or may not be, or may be sold, you've got the benefit of potentially a 0% tax rate in super. And that's pretty phenomenal.
And look, that's a good segue into something else I was going to talk about. And I mentioned in the book that ability to pay less tax, particularly on an ongoing basis, is absolutely has a huge impact on your total return. Just an example we did in the book, and I'll just run through it again. A $400,000 investment getting 8% annually and compounding with no tax. After 20 years, that's worth about $1.8 million. Now, if you're paying zero tax on that amount, the same investment paid the top marginal rate of 47%, and that was each year on that 8% earnings, you're only going to go to $917,000 or thereabouts. So it's just so critical. And then one of the great things about capital gains is we don't pay that on the accrued value each year. That might be coming, but in super only, not outside of super. But that's another story for another day. But other than that, generally you don't pay capital gains as you go, which is great. But yeah, it just shows you the importance of tax structuring. And the other thing I think, people might buy in the name of a higher income earner, for example, and that makes sense when they're negative gearing. But of course, when they get to becomes positively geared, all of a sudden they're getting stung for maybe 47 cents. So it's not always easy, is it, to choose the right structure that's going to work for you for the next 25, 30 years.
And that's a really, really good point, because, again, it could be the best structure is to have it in the high income owner's name because it will be negatively geared. But then as you start generating a positive cash flow, or you decide to sell it at some point, then you're going to have a capital gain or that income coming through. So then it's really considering, well, what's your longevity of the investment? Why are you investing in that particular asset? And then back to what is the return profile? Is it income generation? Is it that capital growth? Where's the best spot for it? And then you've got the considerations of, well, where are we funding it from? Where is there the capital available? How does a borrowing arrangement perhaps work? In whose name? All of those considerations. So when you consider your previous point about people don't often go and get advice, just all those sentences I've just said really indicate you really need to get that professional advice from your accountant.
And look, today we're not giving advice because everyone's circumstances will, of course, be different. But I do want to just cover off some of the pros and cons, Jemma. We'll just go through some of the common structures that we do see. Buying in your own name, just tell us some of the, and again, I guess it's going to depend on the asset. If it's positively geared, it may be a commercial property, that's different. But let's assume it's a residential property for the purposes of this. Buying in your own name, what are the pros and cons of that?
So a big pro is simplicity because it's in your own name, and then you're not having to do multiple financial statements or anything like that, just from an annual compliance perspective. So that's a big pro. People understand in their own name, and you might get the benefit of the negative gearing if you're a high income earner. One of the big cons of that is obviously when it starts being positively geared or you subsequently sell it, then you're looking at person perhaps on the highest marginal tax rate from that perspective. So that's a big one. And then if you've got multiple properties in someone's own name, you've then backing up against land tax and other sorts of landholder duty, depending on which state you're in as well.
And that becomes problematic as you're growing a portfolio. And I think that's something that, again, why you should be going to seek advice is the land tax rates vary around the country, and it's all. But as a simple example, certainly in WA, if you've got about $1 million of land value, and that's based on the land value, I think it's around $1,500 to $1,600 of land tax. But if you have, last time I checked the scales, if you have 5 times that amount, your land tax bill goes from somewhere around $1,500 to somewhere around $70,000. So it's a really punitive scale. So, and I'm in that boat myself. I bought 2 investment properties in a discretionary trust. I've got multiple discretionary trusts. That's how I do it, but that works for me. But the land values went up, which is fantastic. But now I'm getting stung $18,000 a year, which is quite painful.
It is painful.
But it is, yeah, they've grown in value a lot. So yeah, in hindsight, even putting 2 together, I shouldn't have done that. I should have put them all in separate individual trusts. But that, again, that works for me. I think the other one to just talk about investing in your own name. Look, asset protection, we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Obviously, assets in discretionary trusts and even, I think, super, you can talk to that, are protected from lawsuits and different things. And I guess it depends on the profession you're in, and you can have professional indemnity insurance. But do you find, I certainly see surgeons and other people who are potentially at risk, they buy everything in their spouse's name. What do you see, and what sort of professions should be more focused on asset protection versus the general person out there on a salary?
Well, I think you nailed one there in terms of you've got medical practitioners, those who are high risk for perhaps being sued, and they're the biggest ones. Even if you're a director of a public company, you're a partner in a professional services firm, any of those sort of professions, it's really important that you're aware of what those risks are, and certainly putting it in your spouse's name does work a little bit, particularly with the primary home. Now, in saying that, if you were to put it in talking a standard family, the husband puts it in the wife's name, that's actually, there's been some case law to say that holds. But if it was the wife and they put it in the husband's name because the wife was the at-risk main breadwinner, then that doesn't actually work. It's back to some English rules. So anyway, it'd be interesting to see if that ever got tested, but that certainly is a big consideration there, particularly for the primary residence, because you want the main residence exemption.
Yeah, I've read some stories on that, deemed to be held on trust 50-50. Anyway, interesting. So maybe it doesn't work as well as people might think so. Let's go on to discretionary trusts. Do you find, what sort of people typically use those for investing in real estate?
A lot of high net wealth people use family trusts from that perspective, and that just has the ability to distribute income to members of the family, really. You can't use your kids under 18, but once they hit 18, you can certainly look to use them, particularly if you're paying for their university, etc. So that can be of benefit. There's quite a few tax rules that you have to be aware of when it comes to discretionary trusts, but by and large, aside from a super fund, they're the best one to really have a look at. And you do have the opportunity to even use a company to then distribute income through to, so you can get at the best of both worlds, looking at, a company structure, etc. And then if you set those trusts up properly in terms of the consideration for that asset protection, you can then have the right person in the roles of the controller. So you wouldn't have the high risk person as the appointer of that trust. Usually it is then the low risk spouse. But yeah, all those sorts of things are really important to have a look at as well.
Yeah, and it's again, that's why you need advice. It's a complex area. One of the if you've got a business, I think that's where you can inject income. You can make distributions into a loss-making trust. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, I think, for business people. But if you're on a salary and you want to buy an investment property and you want to put it in a discretionary trust, it's great when it's positively geared and you can start spreading the income around. But of course, in that first 5 or 10 years or whatever that is, and it's got losses, that's one of the downsides, isn't it? You can't take that against your own income, your salary income. It's the losses are stuck in that trust. That's
right, and I guess they're stuck there, but they could be of benefit later. It's just taking on board that for that, like you said, it could be 5 years, it could be 10, however long you need to be comfortable that you're injecting a lot of capital and cash into that trust that you might not get the tax benefit of until a later point in time.
Yeah. Now, we spoke a bit about companies, and obviously that downside is if you invest in your own name or a discretionary trust or even a unit trust, can pass through the capital gain with the 50% discount. The companies, unfortunately, you can't. And do you see many people use companies as an investment vehicle for assets that are going to have capital gains?
Not really. However, in more recent times we have, and that's because of some of the tax rules. So Division 7A is one of the biggest ones there because of the consideration. If you've distributed from your trust to a company to cap the tax rate at 30%, then from that perspective, the tax office doesn't like it and they've considered those are loans. We have to watch out for Division 7A. So a lot of people, to manage that position, they've actually flowed the assets to the company, and then they look at, again, that profile of the investment to hold in the company. And sometimes that could be a property investment that isn't going to get, or the expectation is that it's not going to get that level of capital growth, but high income over time. And so if they end up getting a capital gain after a long period of time, if that's what happens at the back end, then, that's a bit of an unexpected return. But along the way, it's been an income return that they've been happy or comfortable sufficiently comfortable with it being in a company because of that.
Yeah, and in the company, of course, if it's a passive investment vehicle, they would be paying 30%. They wouldn't have to pay the extra up to 47% unless they took it out as a dividend. So that's something else in your own name. It might be 23.5% with the capital gains discount. In a company, it might be 30%. And if you're not ever going to take that dividend out, then it's going to keep rolling. So the downside is less, isn't it, in a company if you're not intending to ever take that money out?
Well, that's right. If you're using the company as that wealth accumulation vehicle for the family group, then keeping it in there and reinvesting that after-tax income is another opportunity that's available there.
What about unit trusts? Now, we run them at Westbridge Funds Management because there's multiple investors, they're not related parties, so people don't want discretion on where the money goes. Do you see many people use unit trusts, and in what context do they use those for investing?
So a lot of the time, similar to what you guys do at Westbridge, we see a lot of people that are invested in those sorts of unit trusts. It's fantastic from the perspective of having multiple people wanting to be invested, and also the return flows out and to the ultimate unit holders, and as opposed to a company scenario where the company itself has to pay the tax and then it flows out a dividend after that. So with a unit trust, the income that the unit trust generates really retains its the components of it as it flows out to the underlying unit holders. So if the unit holder is a super fund, then the super fund pays tax on it as it usually would, almost as if it generated the income itself. And so that's of real benefit. So likewise, it goes out to, say, a family trust owns units in the unit trust. Depending on who that family trust distributes that income to, then that's how it will be taxed. So it is of benefit. One of the downsides that can be there in a unit trust is every year the trust has to distribute its income and determine what that is. So it can't really retain earnings, unlike within a company. So again, it's picking the right profile of structure that lines up with the profile of the investment that you're looking at.
If it's an immediate family group, many people might use a discretionary trust where there's a lot of choice about where the money can go. But if you're investing with your brother, even your parents, your siblings, or even friends, that's where it becomes really important, I think, to have some unit trust structure or company structure with shareholder agreements or trust agreements in place, because they can go a bit pear-shaped. And I'm sure you've seen this, Jemma, where people start out with great intentions in partnerships and coming together, but I'm sure you've seen where it's gone a bit pear-shaped.
Well, absolutely. Those disputes can be particularly nasty. So even if everyone's a happy family member and they're like, right, let's do a company or let's use a unit trust, it's really just so important to have a unit holders agreement or a shareholders agreement or a partnership agreement or a co-owners agreement, whatever that might look like, because even though the family members get on great, their spouses might not. Yeah. Or if someone dies, or divorce, disability, all of those things, you're just asking for trouble if you haven't already pre-designated what might happen in those scenarios. And when it all goes pear-shaped, the only beneficiaries of any of that are, sorry to those listening, the lawyers.
Well, we have a few lawyers listening, and yes, they're probably rocking up 6-minute increments right now and sending us a bill. And that is unfortunately a fact of life, and people don't realise it, do they? If there's, especially if you're 50-50, it's not that easy. Just if you want to sell out without a unit holder agreement or shareholders agreement, and you want to sell and the other party doesn't, you're kind of locked in, aren't you? You
are, and people, when they go into business with others, they always will, it's front of mind. We need a shareholders agreement. We need a unit holders agreement. But if they're buying assets together, they don't. It's not doesn't have that same emphasis. And I think that it's really important that people go into those sorts of arrangements as if it's a business decision. It's an investment decision. It's really important that they're aware of when it does all go pear-shaped. You don't want to be that statistic.
Yeah. Your favourite topic, self-managed super funds. I know that gets you excited every day. Tell me about some of the pros and cons of investing in property in a self-managed super fund.
Oh, well, where do we start? Now, I've been told that I've got limited time. Okay, so a self-managed fund, the main benefit of using an SMSF is the tax breaks that are available. So instead of the highest marginal tax rate, you've got a 15% tax rate in a self-managed super fund. So that's fantastic. Now, that's on income. If you're in pension phase and you've retired, that rate can be zero. borrow. So you mentioned earlier where someone's paying 0% tax, what a difference that makes. And then you get a 1/3 discount on capital gains. So at worst, you're paying 10% on long-term capital gains if you've held them for longer than 12 months. So that is fantastic. Now, one of the other benefits of it is super in Australia is compulsory. So most people have got money that has been kicked into super by their employer over a long period of time. And also it's tax effective for people to make extra contributions to super if they're not employed as an employee, but perhaps they're self-employed, or just to top up to what their limits are. So there's often a reasonable amount of capital for some people in their super that they can look at. Now, the downside, though, of using super to buy property is that you can't access your super until you're at least 60. Now is what the preservation age is. And so that can be a challenge because people might want to spend the returns that they're getting. And what I talk to people about there is, look, this is an investment vehicle that you can then spend the returns on the next investment. So it's just that compounding effect that you get in super, which is so fantastic. Now, if someone's looking to use their super to borrow and buy a property, the other thing they also need to be aware of is that you can't use the equity in that property for any further borrowings either in the fund or outside. And so for some people that can be a deal breaker, because if the property goes up in value in 10 years' time by $500,000, they want to be able to use that equity for the next property acquisition. And that's one of the things I know in your book you talk about at length, using that equity for the next acquisition. So that can be a challenge using super. So people just need to be aware of what those limitations are. But if they're aware of that and they take that on board, it's a great capital or area where there's capital available for an acquisition.
And again, you can't, if you're buying in your super fund, you cannot just go out and you're borrowing, you cannot just go out and buy it and put it in a contract. There's all bare trusts that have got to be set up. And if you can give us the 30-second version, Jemma, on that.
Right.
It's a complicated structure. It's not just actually directly in the super fund, is it?
That's right. It has to be held custodially, so in a bare trust. So instead of it being, say, Jemma Super Proprietary Limited as trustee for the Jemma Super Fund, it would be Jemma Property Proprietary Limited as bare trustee for Jemma Super Proprietary Limited as trustee for the Jemma Super Fund. So getting that on the offer and acceptance correct is vital.
We've been through all the different structures, and there's pros and cons of each. But I want to talk about other asset protection. We talk about asset protection of the property assets, but certainly from what I've seen along my journey, personal circumstances. So look, we can't insure against divorce, sadly, but we can insure against other things like serious personal injury or death. So do you want to just tell us? And obviously, this is not advice for people; they've got to go and seek their own advice. But just tell us how you work with clients and in terms of insurance, and whether you work with referral partners. What do you see about insurance, and particularly when people have debt?
So the consideration there is a lot of people are underinsured, and I think that's a statistic that the Australian Bureau of Statistics would provide, and people don't think twice about making sure the bricks and mortar property is insured, but then they don't insure themselves. And so you're your biggest asset, really. And so it's so important that people have got income protection insurance, and then when they have debt, that life insurance cover to pay the debt off, particularly on the family home, and then in order to replace the income or invest that to replace the income of the main breadwinner if they're the one who has died. The other thing that people might think, oh, yep, life insurance, that's all fine, I've got that in place. If they've got automatic insurance through their super fund, which a lot of people do have, that's just not generally sufficient to cover their debts. And the other thing is, what happens if you don't die and you end up disabled, and then who's covering that? So that income protection, and if you've got income protection cover in your own name, the premiums are tax deductible, so that's a good one there. And you can have life insurance and total and permanent disability in super, so your super contributions can be used to pay for that. So there's lots of things there that people can do, but being underinsured is, I think, a big risk that a lot of people have.
Yeah, and look, I've always carried it, and it's sadly, I'm over 50, and when you get over 50, it starts to ramp up. That means I'm more likely to exit this earth than someone in their 30s, apparently. But it is relatively inexpensive, isn't it? Particularly in your 20s, 30s, and even early 40s, and that's a phase that that you certainly want to think about taking out. Now, it does get a bit more expensive as you get older, but you can dial it down. Potentially, you don't need as much. You might have a lot more equity. And I guess that's why you've got to see a financial advisor to talk about this because, yeah, exactly right. Super insurance is pretty limited and low. And if you're building a multiple asset property portfolio, the insurance in super is just not going to come anywhere near what you actually need, is it?
Well, there's that element of it, absolutely. But also, as the premiums become more expensive, and that's generally as you're getting older, you kind of want your super to be as high as possible. And so you don't really want to be paying that out of your super fund and then really cutting back massively on the net contributions that you might be making into the fund. And then you've got to look at if someone dies or becomes incapacitated, making sure that sometimes in super there's particular conditions of release. So the circumstance may well be that the policy pays out, but then the person can't access it. So then it's useless as a chocolate teapot, really. So that's a really big consideration too.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, lots to think about today. Jemma, thank you very much for joining us. Have you got if you had one tip for someone thinking of investing in property and structures, what would you give them?
Oh, well, I think it's just really important to get advice. So whether it's the right sort of investment, because people can get FOMO and think, I've got to go and buy a property and I've got to buy property in my super fund, I often get that one. But if you buy a terrible property, then just because you could do it doesn't mean that you should. And so getting that advice on whether it's the right sort of asset and then overlaying that with, okay, that's great, but what's then the right structure for that? And what's that long-term intention? Because you don't want money trapped in super if you've got a shorter term intention of a development or the like. But there's definitely a lot of opportunities out there to structure it right and then get the best long-term outcome.
Just a final piece of advice from me. Building wealth through property isn't just about building the wealth, it's obviously what you can keep at the end as well. And that means about protecting your assets so they're still yours and you can use that money as you please, but also minimising our tax to the extent legally we can on the journey on the way through. That can certainly have a big impact on our compounding returns and how much wealth we build. There's lots of different structures out there that you might think about using to invest in property or any particular asset. Everyone's different and they may not be suitable for you. What might be right for your friend may not be right for you. So please go and seek advice. If you get the structures right in the first place, it can certainly save you a lot of tax on the way through, but importantly also save you from a lot of headaches. Thanks for tuning in. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to rate us to help others discover the show. Please note that the information shared on Property Investing Roadmap is general in nature and doesn't take into account your individual circumstances. The information is for educational purposes only and should not be relied on for investment or financial decisions. Always seek professional advice before deciding whether to invest.